Sophie Turner had always dreamed of something bigger than the life she found herself in. At just 23 years old, she worked as a waitress in a small, worn-down diner called Rosie's in the heart of New York City. The diner, with its cracked tiles and faded neon sign, felt like a reflection of her life, stuck in a cycle of work and survival. Yet never quite giving up hope. Despite the endless shifts, the long hours, and the meager tips, Sophie was known for one thing: her smile. It was the kind of smile that made you feel like you mattered. Even if it was just for a moment. Even if you were only a customer passing through. But Sophie's kindness extended far beyond the walls of the diner. Every evening, as the city buzzed with life and the streets began to quiet, she would gather leftover food from the kitchen and hand it out to the homeless people she encountered on her walk home. It wasn't much, but to the recipients, it was everything. Sophie always believed that these small acts of kindness were what truly mattered. In a world where so much was out of her control, offering a warm meal was something she could always give. One particularly cold winter evening, as Sophie made her way through the wet streets, her jacket pulled tight around her against the biting wind, she spotted a small figure huddled under a bus stop shelter. The figure was a young boy, no older than 8, shivering in the rain. His clothes were soaked through, his face pale and frightened. Without a second thought, Sophie walked over to him, her heart aching at the sight. "Hey there," she said gently, kneeling beside him. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy looked up at her, his wide, frightened eyes filling with tears. "I don't have anyone," he whispered. "I'm hungry." Sophie's heart clenched. Without hesitation, she reached out and took his small, cold hand in hers. "Come with me," she said softly. "I'll get you something warm." They walked together back to the diner, the rain soaking them both. But Sophie didn't care. As they entered, the warm lights of the diner wrapped around them like a hug. Sophie quickly wrapped the boy in a blanket and brought him a steaming bowl of soup. As he ate, his face lit up with gratitude. And for the first time that night, Sophie felt a sense of warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just the warmth of the soup, it was the warmth of knowing that she had made a difference in this boy's life. If only for a moment. What Sophie didn't realize was that across the street, in a sleek black car, someone was watching. James Dalton, a billionaire businessman with a reputation for being sharp, private, and unapproachable, sat in his car, his attention drawn to Sophie. He had been driving through the neighborhood after a long, stressful day, seeking some quiet to clear his head. But then he saw her. At first, it was only curiosity. Why was a young woman out in the rain, kneeling beside a homeless child? But as he watched Sophie lead the boy to the diner and care for him, something inside him stirred. He scribbled down the name of the diner and drove away. But the image of Sophie stayed with him, lingering in his thoughts long after he had returned to his luxurious penthouse. There was something about her, something genuine, something pure, that captivated him. For the next few days, Sophie continued with her life. She worked double shifts at the diner, barely finding time to think about the boy she had helped. She was also busy taking care of her younger brother, who relied on her to pay his school fees. But the memory of the boy's smile stayed with her, giving her the strength to keep going, despite the exhaustion. Meanwhile, James couldn't stop thinking about her. He had everything money could buy, yet he couldn't shake the image of her, soaked, tired, yet so selfless in her care for a stranger. He needed to know more about her. Who was she? What made her act the way she did? There was a kindness in her heart that he hadn't seen in a long time. And it was that kindness that made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. One evening, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the humble diner. James walked into Rosie's. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped inside. Sophie, balancing a tray of plates, glanced up. Her hair was slightly frizzy from the humidity, but her smile was as radiant as ever. James froze for a moment, struck by the familiarity of her face. Sophie greeted him warmly, as she did all her customers. "Welcome to Rosie's. Take a seat anywhere you like." James chose a corner booth, his eyes following her every move as she worked. He watched as she treated each customer with kindness, helping an elderly man count his change, offering a free refill to a struggling mother, and pausing to check on a regular who seemed unusually quiet. Every interaction confirmed what he already knew: Sophie Turner was extraordinary. When his meal was finished, James handed Sophie the bill. He said little, but as he left, he slipped an envelope under his plate. Sophie didn't notice it until she came to clear the table. Inside was a stack of crisp bills, far more than a regular tip. Her hands trembled as she counted the money, her mind racing with questions. She ran outside, scanning the street for the mysterious man. But he was already gone. The sleek black car she had seen earlier was nowhere in sight. Sophie stood there, a mixture of confusion and awe swirling inside her. Who was he? Why had he left such a generous tip? And why did he seem so familiar? Days passed, and Sophie's life seemed to continue in its quiet routine. She woke up each morning with the weight of the world on her shoulders. But she carried on as best as she could. The memory of the mysterious man, James Dalton, lingered in her mind. But she quickly pushed it aside. She had no time to dwell on such things. There were bills to pay, customers to serve, and her younger brother to look after. But that stack of crisp bills, the tip that James had left her, was impossible to forget. Sophie had never seen that much money in one place before. Not even close. It wasn't just the amount, it was the gesture. It felt like a dream. Something out of a movie. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. What had he seen in her? Why had he done that? She wasn't special. Not really. She was just a waitress at a diner, doing her best to get by. As the days went on, Sophie tried to put it out of her mind. She used the money to pay off her debts, to make sure her brother had the school supplies he needed, and to save a little for herself. Still, the thought of James Dalton, his sharp suit and mysterious smile, haunted her. Why hadn't he said more? Why hadn't he stayed to explain? Sophie wished she could have thanked him, or at least understood his reasons. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the diner began to fill with customers, Sophie's thoughts were once again interrupted. She was moving through the diner's cramped aisles, serving coffee to regulars, when she saw him, James Dalton, sitting alone in the same corner booth he had occupied before, his sharp suit as immaculate as ever, his gaze fixed on her. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, and she froze for a moment. Was it him? Or was it someone who just looked like him? But no, this time there was no mistaking it. It was James. He caught her eye, and his lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Sophie's mind raced. She had never been good at keeping her composure under pressure, and today was no different. But she couldn't let herself be flustered. She had a job to do. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "What can I get you today?" James looked up at her, his eyes piercing, yet warm. There was something different in his gaze now, a depth to it that sent a chill down her spine. He didn't respond immediately, instead studying her with a curious, almost contemplative look. "I'll take the special today," he said, his voice deep and measured. But only if you promise to take a break and join me for coffee afterward. Sophie blinked, surprised by his request. I don't usually take breaks during my shift, she said, trying to keep her voice light. Is there anything else I can get you? James chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to soften the intensity of his gaze. Just the special, for now, but I'm serious about the coffee. You've been on your feet all day, and I think you deserve a break. Sophie hesitated for a moment, glancing at the other tables. There was a steady flow of customers, but no one seemed to be in a rush. Still, she had never been one to take time for herself. She had always put others first, always focused on getting the job done. But there was something about James, something compelling in the way he spoke, the way he looked at her. He wasn't like the other customers, he didn't treat her as just a waitress. She could sense that he saw her as more than that. All right, she said, finally giving in. But just for a few minutes. I can't stay long. James nodded approvingly, his smile widening. Thank you, Sophie. She was taken aback by the fact that he knew her name. She hadn't introduced herself. How did he know? How do you know my name? She asked, curiosity creeping into her voice. I've been paying attention, he replied simply. You're hard to miss. Sophie felt a flush of warmth rise to her cheeks. She quickly turned to head to the kitchen, trying to focus on the task at hand. She wasn't sure what to make of this encounter, but something told her that James Dalton wasn't just any ordinary customer. When Sophie returned with his food, she noticed that James was still watching her. He hadn't touched his menu or made small talk with the other customers. His gaze was fixed on her, and it made her feel both unnerved and strangely valued. She placed the plate in front of him, her hands trembling ever so slightly. As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel his eyes on her. The sensation was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to push the thought aside. She had a job to do. After a few more minutes, Sophie finally took a deep breath and walked over to James's booth. She hadn't taken a break in ages, but for some reason, she felt like this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. She sat across from him, taking a seat without asking permission. James studied her for a moment before speaking. Tell me, Sophie, why do you do it? Why do you help the homeless? Most people would just walk on by. Sophie blinked, caught off guard by his question. She had never really thought about it that way before. To her, it was just something she did. It felt right. I don't know, she said quietly. I guess, it just feels like the right thing to do. People need help, and if I can offer it, even just for a moment, I will. James looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. That's what I thought, he said softly. You have a rare gift, Sophie, a gift that can change the world. Sophie frowned, confused. I'm just a waitress. I'm not changing the world. James shook his head. You're more than that. You've already changed someone's world, my world. And I'm not the only one. Before Sophie could respond, James stood up, his movements graceful and sure. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to her. Take this, he said quietly, his tone firm. You deserve it. Sophie's hands trembled as she took the envelope. She didn't know what to say. Don't open it now, James added. But when you do, you'll understand. With that, he turned and walked out of the diner, his figure disappearing into the busy New York street outside. Sophie sat there, the envelope heavy in her hands. What had just happened? What did he mean by all of this? Sophie sat at the booth, the envelope heavy in her hands. It was plain, unmarked, and yet it felt like the most significant thing in the world. Her heart raced as she looked down at it. wondering what on earth James Dalton could possibly want from her. What kind of man hands over an envelope like that, tells you to open it later, and walks away without a word? The more she thought about it, the more questions popped into her head. She glanced around the diner. The usual crowd of regulars was starting to trickle in for their afternoon meals. And the hustle and bustle of the diner was filling the air again. But Sophie felt disconnected from it all. The usual noises, the chime of the bell above the door, the clatter of dishes, none of it seemed to matter. Her mind was focused on the mysterious envelope in front of her. For a moment, she considered opening it right there, in the middle of the busy diner. But something told her it wasn't the right time. It wasn't just the way James had spoken, there was an air of gravity in his voice. As though whatever was inside the envelope would change things, would change her. So, Sophie tucked the envelope into her apron pocket and tried to focus on her shift. The hours dragged on, each moment feeling like a countdown. And when the diner finally cleared out, she quickly finished her work and locked up for the night. The anticipation gnawed at her as she walked home. The envelope a constant reminder of the strange encounter earlier that day. When she finally reached her small apartment, she locked the door behind her, threw her coat on the couch, and sat down at the kitchen table. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp in the corner. Sophie took a deep breath and pulled the envelope from her pocket. She stared at it for a moment, feeling the weight of what was to come. There was no going back now. Her fingers trembled as she tore the envelope open. Inside was a check. Sophie blinked in disbelief as she stared at the staggering number written on it, $50. Her hands shook even more as she carefully unfolded the note that was tucked beneath the check. The handwriting was neat, confident, almost elegant. Your kindness has inspired me. Use this to create the future you deserve. A grateful stranger. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't comprehend what she was reading. $50. The amount of money that could change everything. It was more than she had ever dreamed of having in her entire life. What was the catch? Who would give her this much money without expecting something in return? She stared at the check for a long moment, unsure of what to do. The thought of returning it crossed her mind. But that seemed impossible. What could she possibly say to James Dalton if she tried to return this gift? Would he even take it back? More than that, what would she do with it? Sophie had no idea. But one thing was clear, her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The next few days passed in a blur. Sophie's mind kept returning to the check and the note. She tried to focus on her work, on the customers who needed her attention. But nothing seemed as important anymore. She spent her free time thinking about what this money could do for her. For her family. It was more than just paying off her debts. This could be her chance to finally make her dream come true. Sophie had always wanted to open her own small cafe. A place where people could come to escape the harsh realities of life. A place where she could continue to help others. Just as she had always done with the homeless. But it felt too big a dream. Too far out of reach. How could a girl like her, a waitress from a rundown diner, ever make something like that happen? Yet here she was, holding the key to her future in her hands. $50. It was a fortune in her world. And it had come from a man who had seen something in her that she couldn't even see in herself. As the days wore on, Sophie became increasingly distracted. Her shifts at the diner felt even longer than usual. The weight of the check pressing down on her like a constant reminder of the choice she now faced. Should she take the leap? Should she follow through with her dream? The idea terrified her. But then, she would think about the note, about how James Dalton had seen something in her. Something good. If he believed in her, Maybe she could believe in herself, too. But she hadn't heard from James again. He had disappeared just as quickly as he had appeared. No phone calls, no messages, nothing. The mystery of who he was and why he had done this for her only deepened. The more she thought about it, the more it bothered her. Why did James pick her? There were so many other people in the world, so many others who needed help more than she did. What made her worthy of his generosity? One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Sophie walked home, her legs aching from the long hours on her feet. She had nearly forgotten about the check, had nearly convinced herself to set it aside, to move on with her life, when she heard a car pull up beside her. The engine was soft, barely noticeable, but the low hum caught her attention. She turned to find a sleek black car pulling up to the curb. The window rolled down slowly, and there, sitting inside, was James Dalton. His face was more serious now, but the same kind, measured look was in his eyes. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. What was he doing here? I hoped I'd find you, he said, his voice warm yet distant. Sophie froze in place, unsure of how to respond. She had so many questions, so many things she wanted to ask him, but all she could manage was a breathless, "Why?" James smiled gently, though it was tinged with something darker, an emotion Sophie couldn't quite place. "I believe in you, Sophie, and I know you've been thinking about what you'll do with the gift I gave you. But I also know that the hardest part is not the money, it's the decision." Sophie blinked, confused. What decision? The decision to change your life. To take that leap of faith. To do something with the opportunity I've given you. Sophie's chest tightened. She wanted to ask him so many things. But all that came out was a whisper. "Why me?" James's gaze softened. "Because I've seen the way you treat people. You see value in others, even when they've been discarded. That's rare, Sophie, and the world needs more people like you." With that, he handed her an envelope. It was familiar, the same kind of plain envelope as before. But this time, Sophie didn't hesitate. She took it without a word, her fingers trembling as she held it in her hand. "I don't know what this is," she said quietly. "You'll understand soon enough," James replied, his voice calm, but filled with an unspoken certainty. He started to roll up the window, and Sophie stood there, watching the car disappear into the night. The envelope was heavier now, more significant than ever before. Sophie stood there for a moment longer, wondering if this was the moment everything would change. The envelope felt heavier than ever as Sophie walked back to her apartment that night. Each step felt weighted, the street lights casting long, haunting shadows on the sidewalk. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. She held the envelope in her hand like it was a fragile treasure. But deep down, she knew it was something more, something that would either change her life or leave her wondering, what if, for the rest of her days. Sophie had always been a dreamer. She'd dreamt of owning a cafe, a place of warmth and safety for those who needed it most. But she had always pushed that dream aside, telling herself it was too far out of reach. That someone like her, someone who worked long hours in a rundown diner, didn't get to have dreams come true. And yet, here she was, holding the chance of a lifetime. She had spent the last few days obsessing over the money and the gift James had given her. But more than the check itself, what gnawed at her was the question of why. Why had he chosen her? She didn't know him. They had exchanged so little. And yet, he had placed so much trust in her. As she sat down at the small table in her apartment, the faint hum of the city outside filtered in through the windows. Sophie placed the envelope on the table and slowly peeled it open. This time, she didn't hesitate. Inside was another letter, its contents handwritten in the same elegant script as before. I believe you can make a difference. Sophie, take the next step and you'll see what I mean. You don't need to understand everything right now. But trust me, this will lead you exactly where you're meant to go. Your cafe is waiting for you. Now it's time for you to believe in yourself. Sophie's fingers trembled as she read the words, a lump forming in her throat. He wasn't just offering money, he was offering her a chance to change her future. To build something of her own. Something that could impact others the way she had always wanted to. But the fear still lingered. Fear of failure. Fear of the unknown. Fear of whether she was truly worthy of this opportunity. She pushed the letter aside for a moment. Taking a deep breath, the weight of the decision felt unbearable. Could she really do it? Could she take this leap into a future that seemed so far beyond her reach? The next morning, Sophie barely slept. The sun filtered through the blinds of her small apartment, casting streaks of light across the floor. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the letter and the check sitting on the nightstand beside her. Her mind raced in circles, trying to make sense of everything. She thought about the cafe she had always dreamed of, a place where she could provide food, warmth, and kindness to everyone who walked through the door. It could be her legacy. But at the same time, it felt like an impossible dream. By the time Sophie got to Rosie's diner, she was already exhausted from the mental strain. The familiar smell of coffee and greasy food didn't offer its usual comfort today. The diner felt smaller, more confining. As she walked to the back to grab her apron, she spotted Marissa, the hostess, walking toward her with an unusual look on her face. "Sophie, you all right?" Marissa asked, her tone more concerned than usual. Sophie forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just tired," she replied, tying her apron on. "It's nothing." Marissa raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. "Well, you've got a full shift ahead of you. Can't afford to be too tired." Sophie nodded, forcing herself to get into the rhythm of her work. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept drifting back to the letter and the check in her pocket. What would she do with them? What if she failed? What if James was wrong about her? Hours passed in a blur. The lunch rush came and went. And by the time the diner started to quiet down, Sophie felt like she was running on empty. But then, just as she was about to take a short break, the bell above the door jingled. Sophie glanced up, her heart giving a small jolt when she saw who it was. James Dalton. Once again, he was standing in the doorway, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to command attention. His eyes met hers, and she couldn't help but feel a wave of emotions rush over her: confusion, curiosity, and a growing sense of anticipation. It was as if he was both a stranger and someone who had already become an integral part of her life. "James," Sophie said, her voice a bit unsteady. "What are you doing here?" James smiled, his expression as calm as ever. "I'm here to talk," he replied simply. Sophie hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'll grab a coffee and meet you in the back." She walked to the kitchen, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. She didn't know what to expect from James anymore. There was so much that was left unsaid between them. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending that nothing had changed. A few minutes later, Sophie sat down across from James in the quiet back corner of the diner. The noise from the front was muted here. And for the first time in days, Sophie felt like she could think clearly. "I've been thinking about your gift," Sophie said, breaking the silence. "And I have to admit, I don't know what to do with it." James nodded slowly, as though he had expected this. "It's a lot to process. I know, but that's the point. Sophie, I want you to take this gift and do something with it." Not just for you, but for the people you want to help. You've spent your life caring for others. And now it's time to let that care extend to something bigger. Sophie's eyes widened. What do you mean by something bigger? James leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. I know you've always wanted to open that cafe. And I also know that you've never believed you could make it happen. But now you have the means to do so. The question is, will you take that first step? Or will you let fear hold you back? Sophie swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. What if I fail? She whispered. What if I can't make it work? James's smile softened, and he reached across the table, his hand resting on hers for a brief moment. Failure is a part of the process. But you can't succeed without trying. You've already done more than most people ever will by simply caring for others. You have the heart for this, Sophie. Now, it's time to believe in yourself. Sophie's mind whirled. James had a way of speaking that made her believe, if only for a moment, that she could do anything. But could she? Could she really risk everything on a dream? Before Sophie could respond, James stood up, slipping something into her hand. She looked down to find a business card with an address written on the back. I want to help you, Sophie, but this is your journey now. Take the first step. You'll find me when you're ready. With that, James turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Sophie alone with her thoughts. Sophie stared at the business card in her hand. The address was unfamiliar, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to take the leap. But as she sat there, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, she knew one thing for certain: this was her moment. The question was, could she seize it? Sophie woke up that morning with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The weight of the envelope, the check, and James's words had all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. This was the moment. She couldn't keep waiting for some perfect sign, some magical moment to reveal the answers. The future was waiting for her, and it was time to take that first step. The cafe she had always dreamed of, her place of warmth, of kindness, of helping others, was within reach. She had the money, the opportunity, and now, thanks to James, the belief that she could actually make it happen. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the people she could help, the community she could create. She stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down her apron, her reflection staring back at her. For the first time, she saw someone different, someone who was more than just a waitress at a rundown diner. Someone who was capable of making her dream come true. It was time to believe in herself the way James believed in her. The address on James's business card had led Sophie to an old building in a quieter part of town. The area was still bustling, but the building itself stood in stark contrast to the shiny, modern skyscrapers around it. It was old, with worn-down brick and faded windows. But there was a charm to it, something that spoke to Sophie. It felt like home. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Stepping inside, the space was empty, but she could see the potential. The space could be transformed. With its tall ceilings, large windows letting in the light, and plenty of room for tables, it could be exactly what she'd always wanted. But it was also a huge risk. What if it didn't work? What if she couldn't make it? The fear gnawed at her, but Sophie pushed it down. James had told her to believe in herself, and she knew, deep down, that this was her chance. A man, older than James but just as sharp-looking, appeared from behind the counter. His eyes were kind, but he gave off an air of confidence, as if he had seen it all. "Are you Sophie?" he asked, his voice warm. Sophie nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, James Dalton gave me this address. He said you could help me." The man's expression softened. "Ah, James spoke highly of you. He told me you had a vision for something great. A cafe, right? Sophie's heart beat faster. This was it. Yes, I want to open a place where people can come together. A place where everyone, no matter who they are, can feel safe and loved. A place for community. The man smiled. I can see it already. The space has the potential. But it's going to take more than just a good idea. You'll need to work hard, build a solid foundation, and create something people will remember. And you'll need a lot of courage. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. I'm not sure I'm ready. The man's eyes locked onto hers. That's exactly what James said. He believes in you. And now, you need to believe in yourself. Weeks passed, and Sophie threw herself into her new venture. Every day was a new challenge, but also a new opportunity. She watched as her dream slowly began to take shape. The space was transformed, with new furniture, a fresh coat of paint, and the warm atmosphere she had always imagined. But there were struggles along the way: paperwork, permits, negotiations. There were moments when Sophie doubted herself. Moments when she wondered if she had made a mistake. But every time she faced a setback, she remembered James's words, believe in yourself. She took it one step at a time, holding on to the belief that she could make this work. And soon enough, the cafe was ready. The grand opening was set for a Saturday afternoon. Sophie felt a flutter of excitement and fear in her chest. Would anyone come? Would they like what she had created? The doors opened, and the first few customers walked in. They were met with the warm smell of freshly brewed coffee and the comforting atmosphere Sophie had worked so hard to create. There were tables for people to sit and relax, shelves filled with books for anyone who needed an escape, and a counter where Sophie would always be there to serve a warm meal or a hot drink with a smile. As the day went on, more people came in, and then, just as the sun began to set, Sophie looked up from behind the counter and saw him, James Dalton. He was standing in the doorway, watching her. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with pride. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she walked over to him, her steps quick and nervous. You came, she said, her voice catching in her throat. James smiled, his gaze soft. I told you I would. Sophie stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. She felt a wave of gratitude flood over her. But she also felt like this moment was something bigger than just the two of them. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in. I don't know how to thank you, Sophie said quietly. You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. James shook his head, his smile gentle. You did all the hard work, Sophie. I just gave you the push you needed. The rest was all you. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She had done it. She had taken the leap of faith. And it had paid off. The cafe was exactly what she had always dreamed of, more than just a business, but a place where people could come together. A community built on kindness. As the evening continued, Sophie watched as people filled the cafe, laughing, talking, and enjoying the warmth of the space. She knew that this was just the beginning. The cafe was only a small part of the dream, but it was the start of something much bigger. And as she looked around at the faces in the room, familiar and new, Sophie realized that James was right. The world needed more people like her. And now, she was doing everything she could to make that happen.